All right, so much art history and never enough time to cover it all. So let's go run through the art museum. All right, part two of our many faceted modern art exploration is German Expressionism. What country do you think we're going to go to? So, which continent is Germany in? C, that is correct. Where is Germany on this map? C, that is correct. All right, it's always easy to find Germany on a map because it looks like a what? Yeah, it looks like Pac Man. All right, after the Franco Prussian War, Germany becomes more powerful. It has a lot of industrial growth, it has a lot of manufacturing and factories. It's having its own industrial revolution. Economy is rival to that of United States and England, but we have a rapid change in modernization that restructures German society. We have a growth of urban areas and a growth of German national identity. What's happening in Germany at this time is the same thing that's happening all over Europe. The Industrial Revolution is making things harsh in the city. All right, before we start looking at some artwork, I just want to talk about German Expressionism for a minute. Before I talk, let's look at these paintings right here. What comes to your mind when you look at these paintings? That scary is one, yes. Say that again. You see a lot of lines. Yes, it's very linear. Good. Does it seem harsh to you? It seems harsh to me. And I'm a big fan of modern art, but I'm going to be honest with you guys. I'm a bit biased. German Expressionism is my least favorite of the modern art. Right? It's a little bit too harsh for my tastes. Right? But it's important, and so we'll take a look at it. And I appreciate the things that they try to do, and I appreciate the things that their influence on other styles of modern art. But they use color that strayed from the natural representation, resulting in a distortion of forms and flattening of picture space, just like what I've been talking about with Fauvism. It's mostly painting and woodblock prints. In an age of rapid modernization, rural citizens are seen as ideal. It's the same idea as the joy of life painting, right? That people live in the city fantasize about that Arcadian landscape. That wouldn't that be nice to go out to the country and get away from the city for a while? And they're rebelling against the bourgeois culture and modernization. The bourgeois culture is the elites. They're rebelling against the elites. And they're dealing with themes of alienation of modern life and that they encounter in urban city centers. All right, so the German Empire is not quite as expansive as the English Empire, the British Empire. However, you can see that they have some colonies in Africa. What this means is that African trinkets and African artworks are making its way back to Germany. And so this primitive art, quote unquote, primitive art, is making its way to Germany, and artists are becoming influenced by them. I've divided German Expressionism into three groups. Most art historians and art history books will divide it into two groups, but there's a third group of artists that don't really fit into the other two. So our first group is Die Brucke, is how it's pronounced. Although I'm terrible at pronouncing German, even though I'm one quarter German. All right, Die Brucke is typically seen as the main style of German Expressionism. In fact, the pictures that I showed you just now are mainly Die Brucke images. It pushed German modern art into the international avant-garde scene. It made Germany like the front runner of modern art for a short while. And chronologically, it was the first of the two. The second style of German Expressionism is called Der Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Rider. And then I've created this other, and I just call it other German Expressionism. And these are German Expressionists that don't quite fit neatly into the other two categories. All right, so Die Brücke, it means the bridge. So why would you name your art group after a bridge? That's it. That's exactly it, right? So they were big fans of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is a philosopher, and he says Man is something that shall be overcome. Man is a rope tied between the beast and the overman. When he says overman, it's also, some people say, Superman. All right. This is before the comic book Superman. When he's talking about Superman, he's talking about what humanity will evolve into. What he's saying is, we used to be primitive. We used to be cavemen who had clubs and would go out and hit a beast over the head and drag it back and eat it in our cave. All right, that's our primitive self. And but we're on the journey to our final version of humanity. All right, man is a rope tied between the beast and the overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. So the idea is that man is not fully evolved yet. Man is still evolving, and that man is connected to his primitive past. But we are not separate from the primitive. This is a huge reason for being interested in this primitive art. We are the connection between the primitive and what is to become. The name Brucke was intended to be symbolize the link or the bridge between the two. All right, I've explained enough about this. So, as they are looking back, these German artists are looking back at the last time Germany had great art, or it was the leader of the art world, and that was back in the Renaissance, that Northern Renaissance of Durer and Grunewald. And I didn't teach the other artists there, but that was another important artist at that time. And they are, so as they're looking back at their previous greatness, they're also looking at the other modern art that's going on at that time. And so they're going to blend the two. So Daybrook starts in Dresden and it eventually ends up in Berlin. I want you to know what a bohemian is. You've heard the song Bohemian Rhapsody, have you not? Have you ever wondered what a bohemian is? It's a person who lives in an unconventional lifestyle, often with few permanent ties, involving music, artistic, or literary pursuits. Oh, and there's a opera called La Boheme. It's about a bohemian. It's a love story, so it's boring. I love opera, but not if it's a love story. Yeah, and that's 90% of opera. All right. Do you guys remember the salon with the small s, where intellectually educated people will come and talk and discuss ideas of art and music and politics and writing and literature? All right. So that's kind of what's going on here. Also, do you remember when I talked about the 19th century rich kids that would hang out with the poor kids? All right, they especially like Manet. He was born rich, but he would hang out with the artists who had no money to be cool. That's also what's going on. So with these bohemians, kind of think of people that are overeducated and underemployed. They have an education either in college of all the writing and the math and the science. They're smart people, or if they're not in college, they're reading the same books as college students are. So they're smart people, but they're not applying themselves to good jobs. They're hanging out and just talking about all the stuff they're reading. Right? That's a bohemian. All right. So De Brucke was formulated by four college friends. These guys were architecture students and they had a traditional education. Check this out. These four architecture students wanted to start an art movement. And so they're trained in architecture, not art. And they like that about that. They're against highly polished artworks and highly trained artworks. And they just want to make it up as they go. So they're not friends of Impressionism. They think Impressionism, these guys are trained artists, so they don't like that. But they love Van Gogh because he's not a trained artist. He's an influence of theirs. I also want to express that woodcuts is a really big part of this German Expressionism. As they look back to the German Renaissance artists so many of them were so proficient in these woodcut prints, and they did amazing things with the woodcut. So the German expressionists are now working with woodcut as a medium to make a reference back to the German past. But what they're doing is vastly different. You can see the main change. The German Renaissance woodcuts, it's all very intricate lines and very detailed and very quite realistic. The German expressionists are being influenced by those African masks. You can see the harsh lines and the abstracted faces, but they're also dealing with big blocks of color, right? Because they're untrained, they're not doing those fine lines that the German Renaissance artists did. And so you can see that in their woodcuts and their paintings, the influence of the African masks. Once again, they're looking back to when Germany was a leader in art, and that was in the Renaissance. So you can see this is a German expressionist painting on the left, and you can see the influence from the past German paintings. Do you guys remember when I talked about the Rotgen Pietà last semester? All right, what did I say about this painting? I said that the Germans were very good at expressing pain. Okay. All right, and I said the same thing about Matthias Grunwald. The Germans are very good about expressing pain, and so we have these harsh artworks, and you can see it again in this. So if you take this harshness over here of the past and mix it with the flattened space of the modern art and the bright colors, this is what you'll come up with. And there's some artworks of German Expressionism that looks almost identical to Fauvism. One of these paintings is German Expressionism, and one is Fauvism. Which is which?
Left is German Expressionism.
Left is German Expressionism? That is correct, yeah. So they were highly influenced by Fauvism. And here you can see that influence again. These two paintings are almost identical, but and what makes them identical is the colors, right, and the flattening of the space and the abstraction. However, you can tell that the artist over here on the right, Matisse, has been properly trained. You can see that it looks more realistic and it has a better sense of the space, where over here, I could easily believe that this is an architecture student pretending to be an artist. All right, it's very flat and the angles are quite harsh. So our first artist that we're going to look at in De Brucke is Ernst Kirchner. And he writes a manifesto for De Brucke. And he does it in woodcut. And this says, "We call all young people together. And as young people who carry the future in us, we want to wrest the freedom for our actions and our lives from the older, comfortably established forces." That sounds like violent revolution. But you should know what a manifesto is, because starting right here, many of these art movements are expressing their purposes through a written manifesto. In fact, the manifesto has been in the news in the last couple of days. There was a school shooter a few years ago, or a year ago, 2 years ago, and they had a manifesto, and that manifesto has just been released within the past couple of days. All right, Die Brucke is primarily in Dresden. Before we look at this first work of art, I just want to look at about 10 seconds of this video. All right, right here. In fact, all right, so I want you to notice the trolley cars and then the way that people are dressed. I'm just going to play just 10 seconds of this. But what we're looking at is film that was filmed back in 1900, 1901. This was a new technology then. And I think what they've done in this video is used AI to just kind of blend it all together, that it's not as jaggedy as it was. But you can see how the people are dressed and the streetcars. That's what I want you to look at. All right, we're going to stop there and then move on. All right, so this is our next painting right here, Street Dresden. This gives you a sense of the size of the artwork. And let's take a look at this painting. And what we're looking at is a crowded street where the trolley has just driven through a crowd, not literally through a crowd, but it's, gone through a crowd. People have gotten out of its way. And what we see here is the empty wake behind the trolley. And that'll soon get filled up with more people in the middle of the street. But if there's a central line down this picture, and look at how the picture is completely different on the left and the right. So, how do you balance these big shapes on the right with the emptiness on the left? And the answer is you make it pink. You make it a bright color, even though it's Pepto Bismol pink. It's not a pretty pink, but it's a bright pink. And that bright color attracts our attention, just like the large shapes attract our attention. And that's what makes this balance. This is quite the opposite of a Renaissance balance that's even on both sides. And we call this asymmetrical balance. And then also, I want you to notice the orthogonals of the Renaissance are centered on the middle. But in here, we have these trolley tracks that are barely visible. You can see that they go ever into the distance. We have this, it's not centered in the middle. But a trolley is passed through and it leaves a brief wake or void behind it, and the foreground will soon be covered again. We have disturbing figures moving through the space. These are middle class women that are out shopping. The lower class women would be working and not on the streets, and all the men are at work. So this shows a crowded urban conditions due to the expansion of modernism. The point of the painting is that these middle class women are made up of, or these are soulless women whose only interest is keeping up with the Joneses. Do you ever heard that term before, keeping up with the Joneses? So if you have next door neighbors, we'll just call them the Joneses, and they have just bought a nice car. Well, that makes you look bad because your car looks kind of crummy. So now you've got to get a nice car like them, and then they're able to paint their house or get a new fence on their house. So you got to do the same thing. They're wearing nice clothes, so now you got to do the same thing. You're trying to keep up with the Joneses. But their only interest, these ladies, is to get material things. But their soul and personality is now empty. They move like zombies through the streets. This is nightmarish imagery. The space is confined and tilted towards us. Do you see that? How the street looks like it's tilted up? This is just like the tabletop of Cezanne and the apples. It's that flattening of the space. They lack any interaction. This is a really crowded space, but it doesn't look like anybody's interacting with each other. And instead, they are on their own little shopping spree. Instead, they are in their own little world shopping. They are well dressed, but they lack any movement or soul. And it's movement without any sense of mindful behavior. In the background, we have a massive crush of people, like crowded spirits. But look at the garish colors of the oranges and the greens together. I've never really liked orange and green unless it's on a pumpkin, right? And even that's like, it's not a good color combination. It's a harsh contrast of green and orange and pink. And then look at the faces of the women. Do they look alien to you a little bit? They look a little bit sickly, like the color of their faces is all wrong. The colors of their faces are these bright colors, but then it's penetrated by black, lifeless eyes. Is this makeup or is this their real face? Or is it a mask that she's wearing? Or is the makeup the mask? You can never really know who she is. She is soulless. And it has the same kind of color scheme as Van Gogh's Night Cafe, with the harsh colors that don't go well together, as opposed to the nice colors of the joys of life. All right, and then very quickly, I just want to introduce this painting to you. This is almost the same scene, but we are in Berlin now. And we have a couple of prostitute women walking through a crowd of men. Now, are these men middle class or low class or high class? High class, how can you tell? Yeah, top hats are a dead giveaway. But look at how they're all dressed the same. I always see these videos or films of like back in the 19 teens, the 1920s, and all the guys are wearing the same thing. And I just can't imagine going to the store and only having black to choose from. And then everybody's wearing, the police officer like ask you, what did he look like? Well, he was wearing black, so World War I was coming, and he didn't want to be drafted into the army. He didn't want to be put on the front lines just to die. So he volunteered to be a driver. So he was part of an artillery unit. And so I put in this picture. It shows a truck in World War I pulling artillery. So he drove trucks like this one. And even though he wasn't in the fighting, he still saw a lot of terrible things. So during the war, Kirchner turned to alcohol and drugs, and he became addicted to drugs and alcohol. And his addiction led to him becoming paralyzed in his hands and his feet for a while. So the army declared him unfit for service due to his issues and his general health, and he was sent away to recover. And while he was recovering, he painted this. So this is a self-portrait wearing a soldier's uniform, but he's not on the battlefield. He's in a studio. So here's the contrast between what the artist is wearing and where he's standing. When he's wearing a soldier's uniform, that's a uniform of violence, because that's what soldiers do. They're violent. But an artist is generally peaceful, are they not? We're not worried about bands of artists walking down the street and causing all kinds of trouble, although, I don't know, maybe. There's a nude model behind him. But look at his hands. What's wrong with the hands?
They look like claws.
One looks like a
One is
claw,
cut off.
and the other one's cut off, yeah. So the painting is divided in
Yeah,
half.
it's actually really-
So on the left half is the artist, and on the right half is the model. And if you look at that model, it looks rather androgynous. Like it could, do you know what androgyny means?
Yes.
Yeah,
Baby does.
it means it could be a man, it could be a woman. He painted a lot of unidealized nudes. That was one of the hallmarks of De Brucke. But the nude is roughly sketched, elongated, has tapered limbs. This is typical of the style of Kirchner's nudes from this period. But you can see the influence of Africa and primitive art on the face that he has for himself in this painting. But there's more to it than just an influence from Africa. His eyes are staring and glazed over. His face is thin and emaciated. He has bags under his eyes. And there's a really high contrast of color. Like his skin is light, but the collar is quite dark. And we have pinks and oranges up against the blues of his uniform. So Kirchner, he volunteered for the army because he was afraid to die or become maimed in the war. But in a sense, his own fears came true. He became paralyzed because of the war. And so this painting is an exploration of Kirchner's personal fears. The severed hand on his painting is not a literal injury that he got, but a metaphor for his injuries. His body was not injured, but his mind was. Becoming paralyzed in the hands is death to the artist. And in the metaphor, he wants to paint, but he can't because of his psychological issues. But it's difficult to show internal struggle in a work of art. So he shows his internal struggle as an external injury. And we can compare this to an earlier painting that he did 5 years before. It's almost the same painting where you have the artist and a model in the studio. The artist stands confidently in the studio in a striped robe. But look at his face. It looks a lot rounder. And he's holding a brush and a palette. What's funny, though, is he's wearing less clothes than the model seated behind him. This clearly suggests a sexual relationship between the artist and the model. But even the warm colors give the work a sensuous atmosphere. And this is the artist at his height of his youthful confidence. So then compare that with the 1915 painting. The soldier, Kirchner, looks sallow and angular, and the painting uses darker, colder colors. And the model in the later painting looks more like a carved statue than an actual person. Then compare the skinny, limp cigarette versus the pipe that he was using in the earlier painting. So even his tobacco is denying him. And the soldier artist is surrounded with everything that he needs. Like he's standing in a studio. So, the paints are there, the brushes are there, the canvases are there, but he's unable to work because of his psychological problems. Hey, just for fun, everybody, this painting reminded me of the meme where the painter asked, "Do you feel comfortable with nudity?" And the model says, "Yeah." And so the painter says, and that's kind of like the same thing of what's going on in the Kirchner painting. It's funny, right? Yeah. All right. So in this painting, he's feeling useless as an artist. He's feeling useless as a German. He wants to give back to his country. He wants to contribute, but he can't. But this is a masterpiece of psychological drama. All right, let's move on to Emil Nolde. He's the oldest of the group, De Brucke. And before he joins De Brucke, he's painting like this. He paints like an impressionist. And he's already a seasoned painter. He's already selling his artwork. But then he goes and does this.
Oh.
Yeah, right? All right. I'm going to expose my bias here. And of all the paintings that we're going to look at this semester, I like this one the least.
I agree.
It's a hideous, hideous painting. But when you Google De Brucke, this painting almost always comes up as one of the first paintings. So it's an important painting according to the experts. So he joined the group in 1906. This is a painting of a still life of masks. Notice the wild colors that are in and the wild brushstrokes that are in this painting. He's influenced by the style of symbolism. We never talked about symbolism in this class. It was a movement a few years before De Brucke. And he's particularly interested in James Ensor. And James Ensor uses a lot of masks in his artwork. And you're all familiar with the Scream by Edward Munch. And that face right there looks a lot like a mask. In fact, that just might be a person holding up a mask and not an actual person that's screaming.
It looks like a literal scream.
Yeah. Here's another painting by James Ensor where he paints himself surrounded by masks. So he painted a lot of masks. Ensor was skeptical of the material world. He didn't trust the real world around him. He felt an anxiety that caused him to see nothing but death and decay everywhere. And Nolde pushes these ideas further. But one thing that's interesting about this painting of the masks is that Nolde lived in this museum here, an ethnological museum in Berlin, and on display in this museum would have been masks from Africa that he would pass by almost daily in his regular routine. So he would have seen these masks on a daily basis, and then he incorporates them into his artwork. This is not a simple copy of Mask, nor is it Mask placed on the faces of people, but these are haunting images of the distorted faces to reflect the effect of modern life on the artist's soul. Here's another one of his paintings that I want you to remember, Crucifixion. We'll be seeing this painting again this semester. Nolde reintroduced religious art. I have stressed a lot how these modern artists are trying to get rid of or get away from the traditional history paintings. Why would this guy want to bring it back? And the answer is that this group, De Brucke, is trying to reintroduce Germany as an important artistic center. And so they're looking back at their history of the German Renaissance paintings, and they are reviving some of these themes and some of this imagery. So they're looking back at Matthias Grunwald and others that were popular in the German Renaissance. Now I want to read you a quote by Nolde. It says, "Glory be to our strong, healthy German art. I much prefer the holy German Madonnas invested in the soul of Grunwald and others over the Latin superficially representable paintings by Raphael. All the arts of all the Mediterranean people share certain qualities. Our German art has glorious qualities of its own. We respect the art of the Latins, but German art has our true love. These proud, sublime works of Nordic Germanic peoples These are eternal truths. So he's talking about how he doesn't like the Italian Renaissance, but he is loving the German Renaissance. And what difference do you see between these two?
One is darker.
Yes, right. The Germans are very dark in their imagery. And look at how light the Italian one is. It looks like, you can walk way into that distance. And on the left, if I walked way into the distance, I might have a good day. But on the right, if I walked way into the distance, it doesn't look friendly at all. All right, here's another one of his Last Supper. I should really turn these blue. I can't remember which one is on the test. On this one, mostly I want you to look at the space. I spent so much time talking about space in these artworks, and look at how crunched up the space is. If you think about Leonardo's Last Supper, in fact, I should probably put a Leonardo painting right next to this one so you can see. But think about Leonardo's, how it has, even if you think about the back of Jesus in that painting, how far is it from his back to the back wall? You would imagine it'd be some distance. And then there's those three windows in the background. You can see into the landscape in the background. But look how crowded this one is. Again, this looks like the back wall and the window that we're looking through is maybe like 3 feet deep, right? And everybody's just crowded in here. Then also look at the colors of the people's faces. He's added green into their faces, making them look very sickly. And then we have a lot of the green in the faces, but there's a lot of red in the picture. And that red and green contrast with each other. It's not friendly use of color as well. All right, our last artist is Eric Heichel, and he is mainly doing woodcut prints. I love modern art, and German Expressionism is my least favorite. Yeah.
Go back to
Yeah. All right, it'll get better when we get to the Blue Rider.
I hope so.
All right.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to play this video, and she's going to show us how the German Expressionists do a woodcut print. I showed you guys a video on somebody doing a woodcut print at the beginning of the semester, but that was the Renaissance style of doing a woodcut print. This is very different. So let's just take a look-see here.
Hello, my name is Christina Taylor, and I'm a paper conservator at the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at the Harvard Art Museums. Today, I'm coming to you from my home studio, where I'll be demonstrating the color woodcut printing technique that Ernst Ludwig Kirchner used to make the print Bathers Tossing Reeds in our collection. I'm going to be making a small reproduction of this print for my demonstration. And although I'm using Kirchner as an example, these techniques can be applied to many different artists and different styles of relief prints too. In this print, Kirchner is reducing the forms of the bodies and the surrounding landscape to planes of vibrant colors. And you'll probably notice the colors he used right away: black, green, and orange. But I want to take a closer look at some details so we can see some of the subtleties of what's really going on in this print. This is a detail of the upper left corner of the print. We can see the black, green, and orange, but now we can also see a dark green and dark orange color as well. It's tempting to think that Kirchner also printed these dark green and dark orange colors, but he did not. He's employing a clever trick. Because the inks have some transparency to them, where the colored inks overlap the white paper, they appear bright and vibrant. And where they overlap the black image, they appear darker and more subdued. Because of this overlapping effect, Kirchner is able to achieve a depth and heightened sense of movement in the scene. Now we've determined that Kirchner used 3 colors to make this print. So what I have here are 3 wood blocks, one for each color we're going to be printing: black, green, and orange. I'm going to start off by carving the block for the black portion, because that's where we see the majority of the composition in this print. The black block is often referred to as a key. It's possible that Kirchner would have carved all 3 blocks before printing, but it's really much more likely that he would have carved and printed the black portion and then made color decisions from there. So I've transferred my drawing of the black image onto the block, so I have a guide as to where to carve in the next step. Kirchner worked in a very loose expressionistic style, so it's possible that he carved directly into the block, or he was just using a rough sketch. I've also stained the block, and that's so when I go to carve, I can more easily see my progress. So what I'm going to do next is carve the block, ink it up, and start printing. Woodcuts are a type of relief print. So the areas in relief, the areas that remain uncarved, are what receive ink and print. So I'm essentially going to be carving away the background or negative space. Kirchner was a founder of the Brucke, which was a group of artists who explored the woodcut technique and were most associated with their sharp, angular lines. There are all kinds of tools for carving, but Kirchner would have used a knife or a chisel to achieve this roughly cut look. This is what the block looks like now that I'm done carving. Next, I'm going to ink it up and print it. The ink I'm using is a black, oil-based ink, and I'm rolling it on the surface of the block with a brayer or a roller. Only the areas in relief receive ink, so anywhere I carved away will stay uninked and will not transfer to the paper during printing. And now the block is inked and ready to print. For the color printing process, registration or alignment of each color is very important. I'm using a registration system called T and bar, where marks I made on the back of the paper line up with my jig that I've added around the block during printing. There are many types of registration methods, and this is just one example. I'm adding a thin piece of paper to cut down on the friction during printing, and I'm using a wooden spoon to apply the pressure and print, but a bearing or other tools could be used as well. Kirchner printed both by hand and with a press, but I'm going to be demonstrating hand printing today because that's what I think he did for this print, and I'll point out why in a little bit. I just printed these two and the ink is still wet. Here are the 2 blocks that we're going to use to print the green and the orange layers. What I'm going to do before the ink dries on these is transfer or offset the ink onto the blocks. So my black print or the key acts as a guide for where I'm going to carve the colors. I'm using the same registration system to do the transfer, so I know that everything will be lined up when I go to print the colors. Kirchner may have done something similar, but he probably was much freer and less precise with his technique. I'm taking the fresh print and laying it on the block, and then I'll apply pressure and print the same way I did before. But instead of ink going from my inky block to the paper, some of the ink from the fresh print will be transferred to the bare block so I can use it as a guide to lay out the colors. And here's the transfer. I transferred the image onto both blocks, the one that will be green and the one that will be orange. I'm going to start with the green block. I'm using a marker to draw on the block where I want green to ultimately be. The color of the marker makes no difference, but I'm using a green one so it's easier to visualize. In the image on the left, I've digitally separated the green layer to highlight where the green areas need to be. Also, you'll notice that some of these areas overlap the black image, and that's where the layering occurs and we'll see the dark green effect. So now I'm done laying out the green areas. You'll see it's mainly the areas surrounding the figure, with some areas overlapping the black. And I did the exact same thing with the orange. In this case, the orange area is really the interior of the figures. Now I will carve the exact same way I did for the black block. I'm carving away the negative space, leaving the areas that I've colored in relief so they can receive ink and print. here's the finished orange block. And I'll do the same for the green block, carving around the green areas. You see I'm carving away the figures because I don't want any green printed in those areas.
Those tools are very sharp. And if you notice that she's like, sometimes she's cutting towards her hand, like towards her opposite hand. And when I used to do this project with my
Now
students,
I'm done carving all the blocks,
they would
and I'm
like
ready to print them together.
dig into their hand. Yeah. So it was a very bloody assignment for my
Before we
students.
begin printing, I want to take a look at some details of Kirchner's print again, so we can get a sense of how he inked the blocks and also in which order he printed them. First, I want to look at the upper right corner. Do you see how the black area sort of tapers off and has a fuzzy edge? I think this is a result of Kirchner printing by hand. And at the top edge, he applied little to no pressure there, so ink didn't transfer evenly to the paper. If he printed on a press, there would be uniform pressure applied to the entire block, and this kind of effect wouldn't occur. If we look at another impression of the print, this one is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can see that Kirchner made much more contact in that upper right corner, and it printed more fully. This variation between impressions can be achieved with hand printing, and Kirchner embraced this imperfection and really incorporated it as part of his image making. Returning to a detail of Harvard's impression, I also want to look at the layering of colors to determine what order Kirchner printed each block. I hope you can see from this photo that there are several places where the green ink sits very clearly on top of the black, and that the orange ink sits on top of the green. This means that the order of printing was first black, then green, and lastly orange. So what I'm going to do now is finish up our reproduction by printing all the colors together, and I'm going to be keeping in mind Kirchner's techniques as I go. So now I'm all done printing.
So you can see the addition that she has in
And
below
you can see
her.
that I've printed
So she's,
a number of
yeah,
these.
she's printed the whole bunch. So we're going to move on. So here you can see, like, even though that was Ernst Kirchner, she was recreating, they are all the De Brucke artists are printing the same way. So you can see in this one right here, how many colors of ink did they use? Two, yes, the black and the red. And here you see Franzi. She was a neighbor of the De Brucke artists, and they did lots of prints of her. And on this one, look at her face, and you can see the influence of the African and primitive art on this one. But of all these prints, this is the one that I want you to remember. Even though De Brucke ended before World War I, Henkel is still making pictures after World War I in the German Expressionism style. And it shows the psychic weariness that may be interpreted as a symbolic of the German people at that time. Henkel used printmaking as a means of simplifying and flattening the compositions. And he produced more than 1,000 such prints during his career. Although this was made after Brucke disbanded, this image remains one of the most emblematic woodcuts of the German Expressionist movement. His eyes are focused on some distant object or event, while his hands, clasped beneath his chin, suggest a man deep in thought. Possibly he's contemplating the troubled years that have just passed or which lay ahead. And the sharp and rugged lines are characteristic of that woodblock print. It's not easy to to cut that wood so that it looks like nice and delicate. And that's why you have these bold, sharp, and angular images that are characteristic of woodcuts. So, any questions about De Brucke?